September 8th, 1900, Galveston, Texas, a city built on a sandbar, barely 9 feet above sea level, with no seawall, no real warning system, and no time left to evacuate. By nightfall, a storm surge over 15 feet high will swallow the entire island. By morning, the city will be gone. Not damaged, gone. Entire neighborhoods erased down to their foundations. The death toll will never be known with certainty. Estimates range from 6,000 to as many as 12,000 people in a single night, in a single American city. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, by a margin so large that nothing else even comes close. And the man whose job it was to warn Galveston had already told the public in writing years earlier that a storm like this, one could never seriously hurt the city. Isaac Klein ran the United States Weather Bureau office in Galveston. In 1891, he published an article arguing that fears of a hurricane destroying the city were, in his own words, an exaggerated, baseless idea. He believed the shallow water offshore would naturally break up any major storm before it reached the coast. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong. And his confidence in 1891 became one of the reasons Galveston had no seawall, no mandatory evacuation plan, and no public sense of real danger by the time the actual storm arrived in 1900. But Klein's overconfidence is only half of the failure. The other half happened hundreds of miles away in Havana, Cuba, where forecasters had been tracking this exact storm for days and getting ignored by Washington on purpose. 3 things about Galveston that explain how 6,000 to 12,000 people died with almost no real warning. The first, Cuban meteorologists in Havana had tracked the storm crossing the island days before it reached Texas, and their forecasts accurately predicted both its strength and its eventual path toward the Texas coast. The United States Weather Bureau's chief, Willis Moore, had a documented professional rivalry with Cuban forecasters, partly rooted in distrust following the Spanish-American War. Moore restricted independent telegraph communication of Cuban storm warnings into the United States, wanting Washington to control all official hurricane forecasting for the region. The second, by the time the Bureau's own forecasters in Washington began taking the storm seriously, they still significantly underestimated its intensity. The official warnings sent to Galveston described rough weather and high water, not the catastrophic, city-destroying storm that was actually approaching. The third, Galveston had been formally warned years earlier by engineers and city planners that the island's low elevation made it dangerously exposed to exactly this kind of storm surge. Proposals for a protective seawall had been debated and shelved multiple times over cost concerns. The seawall that finally protects Galveston today wasn't built until after the disaster had already happened. At the turn of the 20th century, Galveston, Texas, was one of the wealthiest, most important port cities in the American South. Sometimes called the Wall Street of the Southwest, cotton exports moved through its harbor. Money flowed into the city. Its population had grown to nearly 38,000 people, packed onto a narrow barrier island just off the Texas mainland. The island's vulnerability was, in hindsight, obvious. Galveston sat an average of just under 9 feet above sea level. It had no seawall. It had limited bridges connecting it to the mainland, meaning any large-scale evacuation would have to move thousands of people across a handful of narrow crossings under time pressure, with no modern transportation infrastructure to speed the process. Isaac Klein, the Weather Bureau's man in Galveston, was not a fringe figure or an amateur. He was a respected meteorologist, well regarded within the Bureau, who genuinely believed based on the science available to him at the time, that the shallow continental shelf off the Texas coast would dissipate any hurricane's energy before it could deliver a truly catastrophic storm surge. He published this view publicly in 1891, partly as an argument against the cost of building a protective seawall that some city engineers had proposed. That argument carried real political weight. A seawall was expensive. Klein's professional opinion, carrying the authority of the Federal Weather Bureau, gave city leaders a respectable science-based reason to set the seawall proposal aside in favor of other spending priorities. For nearly a decade, that decision held. Meanwhile, weather science in the Caribbean had developed along an entirely separate track. Forecasters in Havana, Cuba, working under Spanish colonial administration until just 2 years earlier, then transitioning under American oversight following the Spanish-American War, had built a sophisticated, locally adapted understanding of how hurricanes formed and moved through their specific region. Their forecasting had repeatedly proven more accurate than mainland American forecasting for storms originating in the Caribbean. This created friction. Willis Moore, chief of the United States Weather Bureau in Washington, viewed the Cuban forecasters with open professional distrust, compounded by the broader political tensions of the post-war period. Moore moved to centralize hurricane forecasting authority under Washington's control, restricting the ability of Cuban meteorologists to independently telegraph storm warnings directly into the American mainland communication network. The storm that would devastate Galveston had originated days earlier in the Atlantic, tracking westward across the Caribbean before crossing Cuba on September 4th. Cuban observers tracked its passage closely and warned it was intensifying rapidly even after crossing land, an unusual and dangerous sign that American forecasters in Washington either missed or chose not to emphasize in their own bulletins. The storm continued into the Gulf of Mexico, gathering strength over warm water for several more days before turning toward the Texas coast. The professional rivalry behind the suppressed Cuban warnings had deep roots. Cuba had only become independent of Spain in 1898, following the Spanish-American War, and the island's relationship with Washington remained tense and complicated as the United States Weather Bureau moved to establish its own forecasting authority across the Caribbean. Cuban meteorologists, several of them trained in a long-standing tradition of careful hurricane observation dating back decades, had developed methods that repeatedly proved more accurate for storms forming in the Caribbean basin than anything available through official American channels at the time. Willis Moore, the Weather Bureau's chief in Washington, viewed this independent Cuban expertise as both a professional embarrassment and a threat to centralized American authority over regional forecasting. In early September 1900, a tropical storm crossed Cuba, and Cuban forecasters tracked it carefully, issuing warnings that it was intensifying and likely headed toward the Gulf of Mexico, with a probable track toward the Texas or Louisiana coast. Those warnings, filtered and delayed through Washington's preferred chain of communication, did not carry the same urgency by the time they reached the public, if they meaningfully reached the public in Galveston at all. By September 7th, the storm had grown into a major hurricane, but the Weather Bureau's official warnings to Galveston described only a tropical disturbance bringing high water and gusty winds, language that suggested an unpleasant day, not an extinction-level event for the city. Isaac Klein himself, walking the beach that morning to observe unusually high swells rolling in under a clear sky, began to suspect something far more serious than the official forecast implied. By the time he fully understood the danger, the storm was already less than a day away. and Galveston had no seawall, no evacuation plan, and a population with no historical memory of a storm this size. The hurricane made landfall on the evening of September 8, 1900, with sustained winds estimated at well over 130 miles per hour and a storm surge that ultimately reached over 15 feet across most of the island. A wall of water higher than the island's average elevation above sea level. The destruction that followed was, by every surviving account, almost beyond description. As the surge rose through the evening, entire blocks of wooden houses were lifted off their foundations and smashed against one another, creating a moving wall of debris that crushed and buried people as it advanced through the city. Survivors, who managed to reach the upper floors of the sturdier brick buildings downtown, described watching this wreckage wall grind through entire residential neighborhoods. In the darkness, the screams of trapped families audible over the roar of the wind. By the time the storm passed, in the early hours of September 9th, Galveston had effectively ceased to exist, as the city it had been the day before. Estimates of the dead, compiled in the chaotic weeks that followed from incomplete records, partial surveys, and the sheer physical impossibility of identifying many of the bodies, ranged from a conservative 6,000 up to as many as 12,000 people, a death toll that, even at the lower estimate, makes it by far the deadliest natural disaster in recorded United States history. Among the disaster's most devastating individual losses was St. Mary's Orphan Asylum, a Catholic institution run by the Sisters of Charity, located directly on the beachfront where the storm surge struck with its full, unobstructed force. As the water rose and the building began to fail around them, the sisters reportedly tied themselves together with clothesline rope, with groups of children attached at intervals along the same line, in a desperate attempt to keep everyone together as they tried to reach higher ground. The strategy, born of love and panic rather than any realistic chance of success against a 15-foot wall of water, ultimately doomed nearly everyone involved. Of the roughly 93 children and 10 sisters at the orphanage that night, only 3 children survived, found clinging to debris the following morning. The tragedy became one of the most widely told individual stories of the disaster in the years that followed, a single concentrated illustration of a citywide catastrophe that was in its totality almost too large for any individual mind to fully absorb. Isaac Klein survived the storm. His pregnant wife did not. In the years that followed, Klein became, somewhat uncomfortably, one of the public faces of the disaster's aftermath, credited in later popular accounts with last-minute warnings he gave as the storm approached, even as his own published writing from 9 years earlier had helped convince the city it didn't need a seawall in the first place. Historians have spent decades sorting through the discrepancies between his later recollections and the documented record from before the storm. Isaac Klein's own account of his actions during the storm became, in the years following the disaster, the subject of quiet but persistent historical controversy. His later writings and public statements emphasize warnings he claimed to have personally issued in the hours before landfall, presenting himself as a man who recognized the danger and worked urgently to alert the public despite official bureau messaging that downplayed the threat. His younger brother, Joseph Klein, who also worked at the Galveston Weather Bureau office and survived the storm alongside him, gave somewhat different, less heroic accounts in his own later writings, suggesting Isaac's role had been embellished over the decades that followed. The discrepancy between the two brothers' versions of events remains a subject historians continue to examine when assessing exactly how much warning Galveston really received and from whom. Clara Barton, already a national figure from her work founding the American Red Cross, personally traveled to Galveston in the storm's immediate aftermath, leading relief efforts that included coordinating donations of food, clothing, and building materials from across the country. At 68 years old, in what would become one of the final major relief operations of her career, Barton spent roughly 2 months in Galveston, helping establish the kind of large-scale disaster response infrastructure that the young Red Cross organization would refine and expand in the disasters still to come. Galveston, rebuilt, the city raised its own street grade by several feet, using sand pumped in from the Gulf, an extraordinary engineering effort, and finally built the seawall that had been debated and shelved for years before the disaster. Federal and state funding eventually supported both the grade-raising project and the seawall construction, a level of government investment in disaster-resistant infrastructure that had no real precedent in American history up to that point. That seawall, completed in 1904, still stands today, protecting a city that learned at an almost unbearable cost exactly what its own weather expert had once assured the public could never happen. If you want to understand the disasters where the experts were certain, the warnings were real, and the gap between what people were told and what was actually coming cost thousands of lives, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight.